hours later. A few inches later. Day 2. Day 3. Day 4. A few moments later. 1 eternity later. 3 days later. 12 seconds later. 3:28 a.m. 3 weeks later. Many months later.
So much later that the old narrator got tired of waiting and they had to hire a new one.
Tomorrow. Tomorrow for sure. Eventually. 12 o'clock midnight. 1 hour later. 2 hours later. 3 hours later.
Can you move along? I'm all out of time cards.
Meanwhile, 2 hours later. 8:01 p.m. the next day. Later. 20 minutes later. 6 hours later. Several bad puns later.
70 years later.
Meanwhile, 6 hours later. Later that same evening. Several days later. 6 months later. 2 hours later. 4 to 6 weeks later. 1 minute 37 seconds later. 1 debt to society later. 1 pair of pants later. 8 hours later. 298 frozen patties later. 3 hours later. Epilogue. The next day. Meanwhile, at the Krusty Krab. 10 seconds later. 346 minutes later. Much, much, much later. 3 days later. Opening night later. 3,000 years later. 1 week later. 7:59 a.m. 3 weeks later. 3 days later. 2 hours later. 48 hours later. 8 hours later. The following Thursday. Later. 2 hours later. Thursday. 5 minutes later. 24 hours later. Much later. 7 hours later. Epilogue. Several song-filled hours later. A few minutes later. A little longer than a few minutes later. 2 hours later. 3 days later. 15 minutes later. Several months later. Thousands of tears later. 16 paranoia-filled days later. 2 hours later. Much, much later. Yesterday. Many hours later. 75 years later. 2 hours later. 1 extremely annoying shift later. 2 very boring minutes later. 3 hours later. 1 winner later. The following day. Meanwhile. Later. Just then. What follows is a brief construction montage. We hope you enjoyed. End of montage.
gesture, 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 gesture,
Friday, January 14th, 2022.
From NBC News, this is a special edition of Today, 70th Anniversary, with Savannah Guthrie and Hoda Kotb, live from Studio 1A in Rockefeller Plaza.
On-air streaming service, CBSN New York. Have a great afternoon.
Put dispenser. 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 Put dispenser.
Me and my monkey. It's time to start eating. It's time to start eating. It's time to start. Oh, that's awesome!
bursting into flames after a stun gun sparks a fire. But his family says that's not even the worst part.
The police, rather than help him, ran out of the room, shut the door behind them, and let Jason burn.
Plus, Cawthorn's candidacy called into question what voters say should get him thrown out. And hitting the brakes in Highland Creek, what neighbors say needs to be done now to get drivers to slow down in the busy neighborhood.
First here at 4, stretched thin at Charlotte schools. Right now, hundreds of CMS teachers are in quarantine for COVID.
New on Queen City News at 10, growing calls for justice.
When I say Jason, you say what?
And how parents are trying to change it.
Carolina's own Queen City News starts now.
Now on Carolina's own Queen City News, teacher and substitute shortages. It is something a lot.
Yay, this is the best place on this cruel planet.
Actually, I think with our band, we'll make this place even better and turn it into a universal resort. Oh yeah, by the way, what's the name of this place?
Honestly, I don't know myself.
Sometimes it feels like I'm just
Big shot.